Hi everyone, it's Chris here. When we were doing the audio editing for the episode with Brent here, we realized that the first 5 minutes or so had some spotty audio quality. So we did the best we could to improve the audio, but we hope that the episode is still as good as it can be. So thanks for sticking with us and enjoy the show. Welcome to CISO Insider, Nightfall's chat with Chief Information Security Officers. We host CISOs from different industries to discuss their pathways to the role, the challenges they face in their everyday work, and lessons they can share with anyone aspiring to become a CISO. This podcast brings you into the world of cybersecurity and gives you a window into the most brilliant minds in the business. I'm Chris Martinez. Today on CISO Insider, Bluecore CISO Brent Lassi joins me to chat about the many things he's seen and learned and worked on over the last 2 decades in the cybersecurity industry. From founding one of the first application security companies in the world, to following the evolution of DLP over the years, and now to working in a cloud-native world without a traditional perimeter, and how those challenges led him to Nightfall, Brent has many stories to tell. Here are just a few of the topics we get into today. How security can be a sales tool, the connections between risk tolerance and revenue for a business, and why a great staff around him is the true X factor in security success. We hope you enjoy this extra long edition of CISO Insider with Brent Lassi. Please join us in welcoming Brent to CISO Insider. Today on CISO Insider, I'm joined by Brent Lassi, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at Bluecore. Brent, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure.
So before we get started into the main questions of our podcast episode, can you explain what Bluecore is and what you do there?
Absolutely. I am in charge of security at Bluecore, really all things security and most things privacy. Bluecore is a marketing technology company that helps major brands identify their best customers and keep them for life.
First, we're going to get into some questions about the security role and your career growth. You started out with a very interesting career path as an English and philosophy major in college, and now you work in cybersecurity today. So can you talk a little bit about your educational background and how you came into the cybersecurity field?
I've been kind of a nerd when it comes to computer stuff since I was probably 10 years old. And, I started to learn to write some code on the old Apple IIs and 2+s back when I was, something like 11. And I continued to do that, learning other languages, working with computers a lot. But I really didn't want to take all the math requirements that a computer science degree required at the time because, computer science and math, they're two very different things. And yet the colleges, at least at the time that I went to college, they felt like they were very tied to one another. And I was like, I'm not taking through Calc 4. And so I went with my first love, which was English and writing. And so I studied that through college, but I also continued to work on my technical skills and started a small gaming company back in college, and continued to hone my skills as a programmer. And then when I graduated, I actually went out and got a programming job immediately, and I did that for a handful of years before migrating into security. I like security because it allows you to kind of, do what they call full stack, right? You can kind of touch everything. And I realized at some point that I wasn't going to be the best programmer around, but I had a passion for security. And at the time, application security was starting to emerge as an issue because we were putting all these new applications that we were developing online and in a browser, and it introduced a whole host of new kinds of vulnerabilities, and I started to notice that these were existing. And so I, looked to migrate into that space.
I think you probably covered this a little bit, but if you could go in a little bit more into how your background influenced your work as a cybersecurity leader today.
Absolutely. My background, like I said, was in programming, even if it wasn't from an education standpoint. And at one point, it was in the very late 90s, I was working at a solution company, a startup. We were building applications for, some of the big Minneapolis companies. So there's a lot of Fortune, 500s around here, like, 3M and Land O'Lakes and General Mills and all those. And one day I was working on a program with a good friend of mine, and we started to realize there were all these vulnerabilities in it. And the company we worked for had a network security practice. And so we went to them and said, we think there might be an angle for this application security angle as part of our offering. And they said, that sounds really interesting. Go figure it out. Tell us what it would look like. So we went away and we wrote all these documents. And at this time, imagine there was no such term as cross-site scripting or anything like that. None of these terms even existed. And so we were just kind of making it up as we went along. And we wrote a huge document about all the different kinds of vulnerabilities, so forth, that were occurring in the development technologies at the time. We brought it back to the owners of the company, and they said, "That's really cool. We don't want to do it." And we went, "Oh, okay." So we went back to work. And we went back to them, me and my business partner, Mitch Moon, who's still in the security space as well. And we said, you don't want to do this, but we kind of do. Would you mind if we went and tried it? And we did. We built all this info on your dime. And they said, "We like entrepreneurs. Go for it, guys. We'll miss you." Right. And so that's what we did. We founded Apex Technologies in '99. Which was way too early for application security because you still had to explain to people what application security actually was. And they would think, what, so you just put a password on it? No, it's a lot more than that, right? And, we were one of the world's very first application security focused organizations. There was one other one that started here in Minneapolis at the time. So there was one other one on the East Coast that started about the same time as us. It's hard to say who was first. It was us or them. I don't really know. But we started developing the training that would be necessary. We started developing a code review practice, secure architecture practice, and started refining what the vulnerabilities in application security actually look like. And then we ended up being contributors to the original OWASP manuals and so forth back in the early days. That's how it came about.
So you were talking about your work in application security, and I know you founded Apex Technologies in 1999 as one of the world's first application security businesses. So talk a little bit about founding the company and what the security landscape was at the time.
Well, at the time, most organizations were beginning to, as I mentioned, move to the web browser for their business applications. So they weren't building applications that install directly on the computer anymore, and they're building the web browser, and they were accessing all their company data stores, over a variety of different methods. And the issue is that the books and the guidance that you got from the development technology companies like Microsoft and so forth, and Cold Fusion and all of them, they actually told you to do it in a secure way. Because they honestly, they just hadn't considered the possibility of these applications being, exposures of data or potential, hacking ingress points and so forth. And so it was really up to us as developers to uncover them and go, hey, you really shouldn't be able to just change this value in the URL and then switch to being an admin or switch to saying a different data context. And so that, that brought up the formerly described initiative that me and my business partner at Apex tackled, right? We were thinking there's got to be something here that can help guide companies toward doing the right things. And frankly, when we first started trying to sell this, obviously we were trying to sell something that was completely new idea. And, developers were a little bit surly about it because they said, oh, no, our applications are fine. They don't have any of these problems. We actually ended up sometimes, showing them compromises of their environment right in a meeting, saying like, I bet that if you put a colon and a backslash here and then type something, it's probably going to, and things happen in their web browser apps, the browser-based apps that they were like, oh, I had no idea. And, that got the attention of, development directors and CTOs and so forth to say, well, we can't have this happening, especially for public-facing applications. And so, we designed an entire training course around the various vulnerability types and how to mitigate them, help build libraries that would help protect applications just by being kind of plugged in. Although, we've always said that it's important that security is baked into an application, not just frosted on at the end. And so it's important to make sure the developers understand while they're doing it, what possible risks there are. And it means that if you think about people who work in the networking space, traditional hardware routers, firewalls, and so forth, or people who are system engineers on servers and so forth, a good solid chunk of their job has always been to be security people. right? There's like a chunk of it that's just like, oh, yeah, I have to restrict access to this, and I have to make these settings on the servers. Well, developers in the pre-2000s, they didn't have any of that inclination, and so it was something that had to sort of be baked into developers over the course of the last 20 plus years. And it was new, right? Now developers come right out of college, and they kind of understand security concerns at some level already, even if they haven't been burnt by it in their profession yet. They understand the need, where if you go back 20, 25 years, the need was not even understood. And so it was a huge problem. There's a lot of vulnerabilities. I'm a firm believer in source code review by humans, because only humans can really see some of the issues. Most of the technologies that we have, even today after all these years, can really only detect about half of the different classes of application vulnerabilities. So having people look at it is really important.
For our listeners who don't know what application security is, can you describe it briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. It is writing tamper-resistant code is what it is. It's making sure that if I'll take it to the easiest level, is that if you've got a field on a web page that says it's a zip code field, well, it should not accept anything besides for numbers. And if it accepts anything besides for numbers, there's the possibility that once it gets passed along to the backend systems and so forth, that it will behave unexpectedly with unexpected results. Now, it can get way more complicated than that when you start thinking about applications that have a number of different permission roles associated with them. The deeper that the business logic goes, the more potential opportunities for a user doing something that you didn't expect that could lead to a security vulnerability. Back in the original days of people making these mistakes that were the really, really bad ones, you could maybe change a 0 to a 1 and switch yourself from being you to being the admin of the environment, right? Or you could insert a little bit of SQL into a form, and it would end up returning back the contents of the database back to your screen. Those are the kinds of things you're trying to avoid from an application security perspective. These days, those ones I mentioned are the most basic level of problems. They get increasingly more sophisticated and buried and hard to uncover. But when it comes right down to it, I think even today, there's still really only about 13 different classes of application security vulnerability. But most people focus on about 5 or 6 of the really common ones.
You've been leading infosec teams for almost 20 years now. Can you talk a little bit about what you've kept in your infosec leader toolbox as the industry has evolved over the years?
First things first is it's about people, right? As a security team leader, for quite a while now, as you mentioned, the number one thing is having great people. And in security, you have to have the jack of all trades sort of mentality, because, like I said, we're kind of full stack. We need to understand everything from the bits and the bytes to the way memory is stored, all the way up to database architectures and network flows and firewall configurations, and then application security that we talked about in depth. You need to understand a bit about all of it, which means that in security, you really have to hire people that have no fear of new technologies, because they're going to be constantly encountering new technologies. Every time that all of our vendors or our cloud providers or companies that create the languages that we use to make software, every time that they add something new or make a new cool feature, it's another potential security problem or another potential thing that needs to be investigated by the team. And so one of the things that I make sure that I put in the toolbox of every security professional that I work with is the ability to write some level of code. That's a superpower, and you've heard it before, but it really is, especially in security. If you go back to the early 2000s or even before that, people who worked in the security field tended to come from the network backgrounds. They tended to come from server or infrastructure backgrounds. They didn't really come from the AppSec backgrounds, because AppSec wasn't a thing. Now it is the only thing in a lot of ways, because of the advent of cloud and cloud native organizations in particular. At Bluecore, we don't even own a single router, right? I mean, I guess we have some in the office that route Wi-Fi, but that's it. We don't have big Cisco devices or huge lumbering firewalls and intrusion detection appliances that have to be racked and stacked and cabled and so forth. And so now it's kind of all about the applications, even when it comes to the infrastructure, because now you have the term people throw out called infrastructure as code. Because when you work in a cloud environment, you don't ever touch any of the routers and networks at their lowest level. You just kind of tell them with a couple configuration files, like, here's what I want you to do, and here's how I want you to act. And so what this means is that every security person needs to understand rather intimately what it is that the developers, the DevOps people, and infrastructure teams and so forth are actually doing at that level. Because it's not about like, well, if this cable runs to this switch and then this firewall, now you're going to have a network segmentation that's set up, via hardwire. No, it doesn't work like that anymore. You have to do it all in configurations. And so understanding code is key, right? Not to mention the fact that you can get things done so much quicker. Build your own little tools, build your own little detection rules, So the one thing I make sure that every security person should have in their toolbox is the ability to write code in some language or two, right? And they don't have to be enterprise development worthy. My code is probably super ugly, but it gets stuff done and it pushes the progress forward on the team. So that's the key thing that I keep in the toolbox.
Where are the biggest opportunities for learning coming from in the field, both for the teams you manage and for yourself as a leader?
This is a great question. And it's because I think some of the best learning that you can get in the security space is by talking to the people who are inventing security technologies. I talk to peers of mine. They go, oh, I went to Black Hat or I went to the RSA conference or some other security conference. And they don't go down to the showroom floor where all the vendors are that are, peddling their software and hardware and so forth. And they don't do it because they don't want people to sell to them. I look at it a little bit differently. I believe that every single company that has taken the time to put a booth at a conference, whether they are a huge company that's been around for 30 years or whether they're two people working out of their basement who had a great idea, every one of those companies has something to teach us. Every one of them has a little nugget of wisdom that they're like, look, I figured out how to solve a problem. Even the smallest new companies that maybe they'll fail, right? Maybe their product will never come to market the way they want it to, but chances are they still had one great idea at least about how to solve a problem. That idea might serve you very well later, even if you never buy their product or they don't even survive as an organization. And so I spend probably an inordinate amount of time talking to the security technology vendors because I think that they all have something keen to offer us as different ways to look at problems, different ways to solve problems. Nightfall is a great example of that.
Thank you. That's awesome to hear. How do you balance the needs of your teams with the overall goals of the company you work for, like priorities such as business growth and driving revenue?
Security has sort of two sides to it. One is the actual security work, meaning, the bits and the bytes and the configurations and, the code quality and so forth, all the things that go into actually making an environment secure, antivirus, intrusion detection, you name it. But the other side of security is there's an optics side to it. It's about what it looks like. And every company has to deal with that, whether they like it or not. And I can't just have a good security program. I have to have good optics around it as well, meaning that I have to be able to show to auditors, to clients, to boards, to investors that our security program is good. And where it's not good, I have to be able to demonstrate that for them as well, so that we can, get the right, team built and the right budgets and the right tools in place. So, one of the things about that balance is that you have to have at least a couple people on your team who are good at that optics piece, right? They have to be able to go and express in many different corporate languages, if you will, why it's important, where we're winning, where we're not winning. And you need to be able to talk to it in terms of dollars. So when you're talking to your CFO, you need to be able to talk about it in terms of technologies and nimbleness of the environment and so forth with your CTO. Like, for example, I always tell the entire company this actually, but I focus it definitely on engineering. I say, if I ever ask you to do something or I put something in place that makes your job harder, you need to let me know, because that means that I didn't work hard enough, right? I need to find the right solution. And it's not always the first one on my list. I might need to roll back to the second solution that maybe it costs less, maybe it's easier to implement, maybe it increases the nimbleness of the day-to-day. So this all comes down to risk tolerance, of course, right? And it comes down to understanding what the risk tolerance of your organization is. And every organization is on a trajectory of reduced risk tolerance, typically, right? Constantly reducing risk tolerance. When you're a startup, you got 3 people, you know what? Your risk tolerance is extremely high because you have nothing to lose. And as a result, you might not be thinking about all the security things that you need to do that might come back to bite you 3 years down the road. But then, 3 years down the road, you're going to have more what I call belts and suspenders in place. You're going to start to, implement the security things. But that trajectory never ends. As you might guess, the risk tolerance at Bluecore is certainly a little higher than it would be at Wells Fargo, right? And the reason is that, we're a smaller organization. We have less surface. We have less people. Many things within an organization can increase the overall, risk posture. And one of those, the biggest one, is probably employee count, right? Because the more people you have touching things and making changes and access to data, the more risk there is. The next one is how many clients you have and how big they are, right? If you're working with lots of tiny little stores, mom and pop shops or something like that, your risk tolerance is going to be higher because they don't have as much, at stake, right? But if you're working with large enterprises, obviously it's going to reduce your risk tolerance significantly. And then the next thing that it can affect your risk tolerance is your actual revenue, right? When you're making $10, your risk is really low. When you're making $100 million, your risk is a lot higher, right? And so you constantly have to balance that. And it's particularly actually kind of fun and interesting to balance it in an organization like Bluecore because we're 8 years in, but we still kind of feel like we're a startup, right? And that means that our security risk tolerance and posture over the last just even 4 years that I've been there has dramatically evolved, right? We went from, much smaller earnings, much smaller client list to where we are now. And it's only going to continue, 3 years from now, it's going to be a completely different game again. So it's important to keep that in mind, be flexible. Too many CISOs, I believe, come into a role and retain the exact same risk tolerance that they've had in their last role. And you can't do that as a security leader. You need to be able to reset and say, look, the risk tolerance for each organization is going to be different based on your vertical, based on your size, based on your compliance requirements. Are you a healthcare company? Changes it immediately, right? Are you a fintech company? Changes it immediately. If you're a manufacturing company, your risk tolerance probably goes up, right? Because you probably don't have quite as many risks as you would have as a bank or a healthcare company. So, yeah, it's constantly constant reassessment.
I think you spoke really well to all those things. But I'd like to know if there's any other ways that security factors into company OKRs and other metrics.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I'll go back to the optics thing again is that too many security teams forget that there is a business at hand, right? They tend to think like, oh, I just got to secure this stuff. No. You have to be part of the sales cycle. Security works best when it's actually taken off the table as an issue. And the best way to take security off the table as an issue is to be really good at it, right? That's the fact. This is that when we can go and pitch a client on our security posture using a combination of documentation and audit results and me going in and actually just talking to them, if at the end of that conversation, the security team from the potential client or prospect says, oh, you guys really got this stuff together, well, you know what? That conversation is pretty much over. And now we can go right to actually doing business and solving the problems that they originally came to us to solve. And that's something that comes into, our OKRs all the time, is understanding that second component, which is security can be a tool to sell your organization. It can be a tool that accelerates deals and it retains clients. Right. If you've got great position in handling compliance data, handling compliance programs, reporting on it, dealing with PII and all the new privacy laws and so forth. If you clearly have an organization that is handling all of that for your prospects and clients, what I would call out of the box, that gives them a ton of confidence. Because you have all the answers and you have everything that they need already sort of baked into your capabilities. That goes a long way, and we do focus on that quite a bit at Bluecore.
We're going to take a brief break and get back to more questions with Brent Lassi from Bluecore. You're listening to CISO Insider from Nightfall AI.
Nightfall DLP is the industry's first cloud-native data loss prevention solution designed for high-growth companies securing sensitive data across cloud apps like Slack, GitHub, and Google Drive. Traditional data security solutions are painful to implement, require heavy overhead, and have high false positive rates. Nightfall customers are up and running in minutes with our library of machine learning detectors to protect PII, PHI, and other industry-specific data. Our developer-centric platform allows security teams to configure content inspection as code for customizable data protection. Learn more at cisoinsider.com/nightfallai.
In our previous conversations, you mentioned that most people at work treat Slack like it's a corporate environment, but it's actually someone else's corporate environment. Can you talk more about the security challenges that come from using SaaS platforms like Slack, and how you educate your internal users on best practices when communicating in these apps?
Yeah, absolutely. First, let's tackle that whole SaaS scenario, and Slack being the obvious example, but it extends itself to things like GitHub and Salesforce and Jira and all of the usual suspects that people use, Dropbox and Box and even Google and Microsoft as the cornerstone of many people's corporate environment. It used to be that when you started a company, you'd get an office, then you'd put some servers in a closet somewhere, and you'd put an email server on there, and you'd host your own email, and you would host all of your own stuff. You'd host your own CRM, you'd host your own. Well, now almost nobody does that. They might have a few, big legacy organizations will have some of that stuff internal, right? But even they are starting to migrate that stuff out, saying our core competency, let's take General Mills. It's like our core competency is making food. It's not running an IT environment, right? And so they say, well, let's just take that HR system out and go and hire somebody, to use their cloud environment. Well, when you do that, you gain a ton of positive things, right? I mean, obviously, it could be cost reduction. It could be just a better platform. It could be not having to support it. It could be reduction in, the size of teams that is required and so forth. Nimbleness, right? All kinds of things. But what you do lose is you lose possession of your data, right? You lose possession and control. And that's a security thing. Your perimeter all of a sudden got extended out into someone else's network. It used to be that I could put my arms around an entire environment and go like, this is ours. So I secure it at the edge first, and then I start securing the individual components within that. Well, now the edge is almost undefinable because, at Bluecore, we don't have any on-prem stuff. We have no colos. We have nothing in a server closet. Everything is a SaaS tool or something running in our cloud environments. And, our SaaS count probably goes north of 70 different SaaS platforms that are being used. Well, that means that most of our business, day-to-day operations, whether it be finance or HR or, what have you, things like Slack, are actually running on somebody else's premise. So I can't put my arms around it anymore in that sense. And it's important to make sure that people understand that when they post something into one of those tools or into one of those platforms, that they really are putting it out in the world. And because of the way that a lot of compliance and privacy laws work and so forth, it's super important from a security perspective that we know exactly where all that data is going. Like, for example, a good example would be like Jira, for example. When you're posting something in a ticket, if you post data that is compliance impacted in some way, regulatorily impacted in that means that you have a ton of work you have to do in order to validate that platform is okay for storing, say, PII or healthcare information or something like that. Well, guess what? There's a ton of legal and security work that goes into that needs to happen. And you also need to inform all of your clients that you're doing it. So that's a ton of work. What's the solution? Let's not put any data in there, right? Let's not put that kind of data in there. And that's where DLP comes in, right? Where data loss prevention protection comes in is that ability to see what people are doing with all of these SaaS platforms. And then when they go astray, usually not maliciously, usually just by accident or lack of knowledge, you need to kick them back into line. And so it's important to make sure that it's a strong point in your policies and your general security training that people get that fact that they're essentially distributing data outside the company when they use these SaaS platforms, especially if they use them improperly. The nice thing about DLP is that when you implement it and you detect, like say somebody puts, a piece of healthcare information in Jira or something like that, you go like, that is not the system for that to be stored. DLP gives you the opportunity to go and do a micro training session with that person. Say, hey, I see what you did there. I'm sure that you didn't mean to do that and it wasn't malicious, but you can't do that. Well, every time you have one of those little micro education sessions, that person tells all the people that they work with, oh, security called me and said, we can't do that, right? You kind of get this like water balloon effect every time you do one of those. So beyond just the regular training, DLP actually facilitates the further training and notification of those problems in what I think is a graceful and polite way.
I think it's really interesting you brought up DLP because that goes into our next question about the evolution of DLP over your career and what your experiences have been through the shift from the old ways to the new ways of thinking and working in data security.
Yeah, that comes right back to that whole perimeter thing, is that the DLP solutions that I used to have, they had the three traditional sort of modes of DLP, which was data in use. It's usually like when it's actually on laptops and things like that, or on endpoints. Data in motion, so that means it's flowing over a network. And then data at rest, which is, wherever it's stored, whether it be a database or, a bucket of files or something like that. And we used to implement separate technologies for each one of those. And while those concepts are still completely valid, the way of achieving them is completely different because of that SaaS, the proliferation of SaaS, as I mentioned. We used to say, I worked in an organization, we had 9 data centers globally and then 22 offices or something, but they were all on the same network. I could still, even though they were distributed globally, and I mean very globally, and that's like 30 some plus sites, right? From a network perspective, I still had complete containment around that network, even at that scale, meaning that there were firewalls and DLP, appliances and intrusion detections, tools and so forth at every one of those locations, wherever data egressed or when it moved between those locations. So what that means is that you could put essentially appliances in that sniff the network traffic and look for people moving data around and so forth. And they're like, hey, that's the DLP problem. We don't want to move data from here to there. Or we could scan all of our file stores because they were all in our data centers, right? They were all under our direct control. And so we could just like deploy a scanner and say, go scan all this stuff and tell us if there's any, sensitive data in there. Well, now, again, with all of the SaaS tools that everyone uses, you don't have that access anymore. You can't go to Salesforce and go, I'd like to put an appliance on the edge of your network so that I can see if data, you don't get to do that, right? You don't get to scan Salesforce's databases or, directly for PII. And so that's why there needs to be, this new breed of DLP technologies that facilitates similar concepts to those three that I mentioned, but has to do them in a completely different way technologically.
Yeah, and I think you definitely covered the shift from on-prem to cloud native, but you can give us many more insights on your journey as a security leader through those shifts.
Yeah, at first it was really hard because the technologies that I traditionally use, I started using DLP technologies in 2007 when they'd first kind of arrived on the scene as like a as a term. And frankly, a lot of people failed to use them properly. It was one of those things where I would talk to peers and they would say, oh yeah, we bought that DLP tool, whatever it was, and it didn't work, and it then sits in the corner and doesn't do anything for us, right? And I think that that's definitively wrong, regardless of what product you chose. And the reason that I found that most people failed in their DLP journey was because they didn't really know what they wanted out of it. They got the buzzword, data loss prevention and so forth. And then somebody said, hey, do we have this stuff? And they're like, oh no, you should get it, and then they went out and got it, but they didn't really know what they wanted to do with it. I took the exact opposite approach as I said, I want to solve these 5 problems, right? And then we found the right tools and we went and solved those problems and then expanded from there, right? And the programs were very successful and very useful. And when people say, what's the best technology that you deployed? I would oftentimes cite our DLP as one of the top 2, right? now the evolution that you mentioned, what happened was with the advent of cloud and cloud native organizations, and in particular, my move from a more traditional data center and on-prem organization to a cloud native organization, I found myself at a loss because the technologies that I'd been using just wouldn't work. They just plain wouldn't work. And so I started thinking, okay, Brent, how would you do this sort of thing? And to be perfectly honest, I was casting about and thinking, okay, so I need is a tool that will be able to hook into a bunch of different SaaS platforms in one way or the other and use the APIs or capabilities that do exist there to at least keep me informed. And then I found Nightfall, and I said, wow, Nightfall does exactly that. So we had conversations very early when you were literally just coming onto the market. And I said, yeah, that's how it's going to be now. There's other point solutions out there, but what I wanted was something that would be able to handle a number of different platforms in a consistent manner, right? And coming back to the original point was that I also had to know exactly what I wanted to do. I had to have objectives, and we can. I think we'll talk about those objectives probably in a moment. Or would you like me to go through them now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, my objectives started very, very, very simply with I wanted to detect secrets in GitHub, and I wanted to find data that people were posting into Slack that maybe didn't belong there. Right? Maybe it's PII, maybe it's HR data, maybe it's finance data, and so forth. And with the GitHub piece, what I found is that usually it's usually just about laziness and sort of lack of people being educated on the fact that they shouldn't, store credentials within their code base or in configuration files that are stored in a source repository. So once you find them, then you go and you kick and scream a little bit, and then they go, "Oh yeah, we shouldn't do that," and then they go and fix it, right? So that one's kind of simple in that sense, but there wasn't a lot of good tools available for doing that. I know that some companies will claim they're really good at it, but I found that most of them are not and have a lot of false positives and so forth. I was super impressed with Nightfall when I ran the first scan, and I was like, there are almost no false positives in here. And the ones that were there, I was like, yeah, it should have flagged that anyway. I'm glad that that I saw it, but I just was able to ignore it, right? Because I knew it wasn't as sensitive as it might have appeared. But I was really happy with that. And then when I was pursuing that, the CEO watched me do a little presentation on the fact, right, on that problem and how we were going to look to solve it. And this was before we'd engaged with Nightfall. And then he said, I also worry about things like Slack. And I was like, yeah, that's a really good point, because it's kind of the same problem. And that one, everyone has access to it and they can post anything they want in there, right? They can just upload files, contracts, or, detailed financials, HR data. And you just want to keep an eye on that stuff because, it could become exposed to too many people. And back to the prior fact is that it's going onto somebody else's server and pretty much stored in perpetuity, right? So you definitely want to keep that down to a minimum. And that's when I really started casting about looking for the solutions that might do that. And that's when I came across Nightfall.
Awesome. That's so great to hear. And I think it leads into our next question about why data hygiene is so important in your work and how it's connected to data security and privacy.
Yeah, I like that you use the term data hygiene because it's the term that I've actually been using for a couple of years now to describe sort of the current state of the current state of the world when it comes to DLP, right? Because it used to be, like I said, that whole containment scenario, and you could actually, when you had control of all of the networks and all of the servers and everything in the perimeter, you really could contain it. Where now it's a little bit more about just good hygiene, right? Where it's like, there's going to be mistakes, that people are going to do things that might not be optimal, but you rather than strictly preventing them from doing it, because you kind of can't in a lot of the SaaS tools, you have to just be hyper aware of it and be able to, treat it like hygiene, like let's brush our teeth every morning, just like we should. Let's look at GitHub every day and see if there's any new credentials that somebody accidentally loaded in there. That's what it's about. It's about keeping on it constantly. And in Nightfall's case, it's kind of nice because I never anticipated that the solution that I came to would give me immediate notifications of things. But Nightfall does. I mean that I get a notification immediately if somebody puts a file in Slack that has SSNs in it, right? I'd be like, oh, don't do that, right? And before it gets too broadly like clicked on or anything like that, I can say, oh, like, let's redact that and get that out of there. The development team probably thinks I'm crazy because I don't think a lot of them know about Nightfall, and they'll like check something into GitHub and I'll immediately Slack them and say, hey, I don't know, you put this key in there. I don't know if it's sensitive or not. And they're just like, wow, like Brent's insane. How does he know this stuff so fast? Right? And I'm like, well, I didn't do it. It's Nightfall just slacked me and told me that somebody put something in there. And I never anticipated having a tool that would give me live updates like that, but it does, and that's really powerful, right? And so now it's just about expanding the objectives. Like I said, originally I had 2 objectives. I was like, let's deal with GitHub and Slack. Okay, and then this year we said, okay, let's deal with Jira, right? And then maybe next it'll be Box or Zendesk or Salesforce or something, right? We'll just continue to look at where the key areas of concern might be and knock them down.
So we've talked about the shift from on-prem to cloud native, and we've talked about data hygiene. Are there any other big blind spots in data security currently that you're concerned about?
Oh, big blind spots in data security. You mean as an industry, generally? Yeah, I think that there's one, and that is the misallocation of responsibility for security. And this is because this has reared its head mostly because of DevOps and the cloud, the move to the cloud and cloud native environments and engineers that really are programmers, but then also are expected to do security work in that they're configuring environments and network paths and so forth in the cloud. And, if you look back at more legacy organizations, they would have an IT team that was usually distinct from the development team in every way. And those IT teams would include network engineers and database administrators and server, experts and so forth. And usually a security team as well would be usually wrapped into that group. Well, with the advent of cloud native and DevOps, it actually crossed off a lot of those teams in that they don't exist in a lot of new organizations. And they're getting smaller and smaller, or less noteworthy or less powerful, if you will, in larger organizations and legacy organizations. And what I've found is that the responsibility for security, which used to usually sit with like CIOs, that were handling the IT side of things, has not effectively migrated to the CTO environment, which is usually where the development and product people sit and so forth, right? And that's a problem because what it means is that the people that are most directly in control of security configurations and due diligence and doing things, in a resilient, secure, proper manner, actually don't know they're supposed to be doing it. And they don't necessarily have the training to do it either. A good example of this would be, I once hired an amazing developer to run some application security programs for me on a team. And that person is, as much as they're a very, very experienced developer at an enterprise level, really couldn't navigate a Linux prompt, right? Or set up a server, that person could not do that. Well, if you take that person and throw them into a cloud DevOps environment, do you want that person configuring your Docker containers in your Kubernetes environment? You kind of don't, right? That person doesn't know anything about that. And so there's been a big miss there, I think, in the transition of responsibilities and the notification that these responsibilities are migrating away from the traditional roles of networkers and security personnel and server administrators. It's migrated over to that development engineering team, and they need to have the capabilities of doing all of those things, or they need to have a team that's embedded within them that does do those things and checks it properly. So I think that's the biggest blind spot I've seen over the last 5 years, is that the missing that shift in responsibility of security away from traditional IT into DevOps and engineering organizations.
And how do you approach these issues effectively?
Education, right? You've got to, first thing I did when I got to Bluecore is I went around and found all the people that didn't know that stuff, right? Because here's why it happens, and then the why it happens can help you address it. Why it happens is because when companies started tackling this whole new, DevOps model of writing code and developing in the cloud and so forth, what happened was CTOs or CEOs told those teams to run off and go ahead and create new stuff and to not get the other teams involved just because they could do it all themselves in a cloud environment, right? And they made that decision based on the smartest people in their org, right? It was all the really awesome, like full stack type of people that were like, yeah, we could do this. That's great. But that's only the top 10% of your development staff. The other ones aren't necessarily as well versed, right? I mean, and so like when I got to Bluecore, I went around and found the people in the engineering team who were very full stack in that sense, and started to sort of peel the onion, if you will, and find out where the problems might be within, the not so much the products code, but within the underlying infrastructure and so forth. Like, was it being properly set up by people that understood the underlying technologies? And then once you've identified those things, you can go ahead and start pushing that education out to the people that need it. And at Bluecore, it actually ended up turning into something really powerful because we ended up building up an actual infrastructure team that is a slew of engineers and programmers essentially, but who also are really experts in things like Kubernetes and Cloud Fabric, configuration and so forth. So it's about education, but first you have to identify what the problem is and identify not just your stakeholders, but also your champions.
What is your worst cybersecurity nightmare?
I guess it probably would be ransomware. That one's pretty bad. I don't really get a lot of nightmares. People ask me what keeps me up at night, and I say, well, nothing keeps me up at night, because if I was kept up at night by worrying about security things, I wouldn't be able to do my job very effectively and I wouldn't last. I'd burn out, right? I would have made it 23 years in security if I could not sleep at night. So, but I do worry about ransomware, and I always make jokes about what the biggest hack in the world would be. And it would be that if the Google Analytics source code was compromised and served up to the rest of the world, because everybody includes that JavaScript on their website. And so if you wanted to do the biggest hack in the universe, you'd replace that code with something malicious, right? Or inject something malicious into it, because you basically have control of every single website on the internet. Right? So how about that?
So just out of curiosity, how plausible is that hack?
Well, it could be an internal job at Google could probably make it pretty possible. But I'm guessing that they know how serious that code is and how dangerous it would be if somebody injected something malicious into it. So I have a feeling that they don't just roll that stuff out without a lot of review and simultaneous lever pulling and button pushing, right? That happens across a lot of approvals. I would hope so.
Yes, definitely. Me too. What's the best lesson you've learned from your team over the last year?
One of the best things that one of my team members brought to my attention, and I've taken it to heart, is the sensitivity of the access granted to executives. This is probably true more often in younger organizations where the founders are on hand and are now the executives of the organization and so forth, where there's people that have been around for a really long time. But I've found that it also happens at organizations that have been around for 20 years, where if you inspect the access granted to many of the high-level executives, the C-suites and so forth, and sometimes even board members. And sometimes I found the spouses of people that are in those positions. Sometimes you find that access is incredibly inappropriate. And it's not because they're going to misuse it, but it's because they're targets, right? If somebody's a target, you need to protect them. I mean, you think about it like anything, right? It's just like if you were in a hostage situation and you're the police officers and so forth, or the SWAT team, you're trying to protect the victims, the hostages, right? It's the same sort of thing. Is like you want to protect the most the most valuable assets than the ones that are actually, at risk. And I find that the executives of organizations are those. They're the ones that are at the most risk. They're targeted constantly by impersonation attempts. They're targeted constantly by phishing and so forth. And so it's super important as a result that you keep their access really squeezed down tight, right? Not give them, and as much as they might go like, oh, I should have access to that. I'm the boss, right? It's like, well, technically, I get what you're saying, but you don't need it. And you also generate an enormous amount of risk by having that access because you're such a target, right? So, the worst thing you could do is give Jeff Bezos, root access to all the Amazon servers. He'd be the number one target, right? And so you don't do that. And that came from a member of my team who has only been in the industry a couple of years. And I was like, that's really smart. We need to take that. We need to take that as a tenet of our approach to identity management and access, access constraints and controls. And we have.
How do you stay on top of current trends and issues in the field? What kind of resources do you use, like industry groups, newsletters, conferences, and other things?
Yeah, well, first off, I'll mention the conference thing that I mentioned earlier, right? Is like I get it's been really bad this last 18 months where we haven't had the conferences to go to. And even though you could do virtual ones, it's way different when you walk around the floor at a conference and actually talk to the founder or the chief technology officer of these like startups that are building new cool stuff. I get a ton from that, right? That's one of my favorite things to do, and I learn a lot. I read the news and so forth, but I've also found that articles posted about security incidents tend to be only about 50% correct, right? And I know that because I've had articles printed about incidents I've been involved in, and they were only about 50% accurate. And I know a lot of other people who have said, oh, yeah, you see that article that came out about XYZ company? Well, I worked there, and that is not how it happened at all. Right? And so there's only so much you can take from the things that people blog about and write about when it comes to keeping abreast of the situation. I also lean really heavily on trusted partners of mine. Oftentimes they're my technology resellers. As you might guess, after 23 years in the business, I have some really, really long-standing relationships with people that I trust, that are well-informed and highly educated on the risks out there and the technology solutions for those things. And perhaps even more importantly is that those people not only know those things, but they also know what I like and don't like and how I think about security. So they tend to be able to advise me in directions that jive well with my particular style and tendencies for implementing security programs and technologies. So those are the two biggest things that I do probably is conferences, talking to people, and then having those trusted partners.
When it comes to getting cybersecurity certifications, what's your general standpoint? Is it a positive thing or a negative thing?
I think that when you're early in your career, it can hurt, right? Because it shows people that you've taken it seriously, you've done a modicum of studying at the very least, and that you definitely want to get into the field, or that you definitely want to stay in the field and advance in the field. I've found that a lot of the certifications over time become sort of like a treadmill, right? Where you're paying a bill every year and then saying you had to go to all these classes, where when you're in a position like mine, it's actually kind of hard to get those points in some ways, or it's so easy to get them that you're like, well, I could get 1,000 of those points. And so does it really matter? Do I really need somebody after 20 years to tell me that I'm certified? I don't know. So I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's great for people in their first 5 years, but I know a lot of my peers and so forth have let a lot of those things go because it just doesn't seem to be serving any purpose after a while.
Great. And here's our last question. Do you have any podcasts or books that you have read or listened to lately that you can recommend to our listeners?
Yes, I recently read a book called literally called the Kubernetes book. And I'd highly recommend just search for it. It's a Kubernetes book. It's by a fellow named Nigel Poulton. And The reason I bring that one up is because if you are in security right now and you don't know Kubernetes, you're probably missing out on a bunch of things that you should know. I didn't really know the underpinnings of Kubernetes and how it worked. And, using that book, I read it cover to cover, and then I went and actually stood up my own Kubernetes environment. I actually built it out of Raspberry Pis. I put six Raspberry Pis together like a mini cluster. And it's like this big, but it has 6 computers in it. And I installed Kubernetes across it and was able to play with it. And did I ever use it for anything useful? No, I actually didn't. But I learned a ton and got, real hands-on experience. On podcasts, there's a podcast that I highly recommend. It's called Alexa's Input. And Alexa is a coworker of mine who has been doing this podcast for a couple of years now. And she has the most amazing guests across the technology industry. Usually it's highly engineering focused and very technical, but has had just some amazing guests. I think that it's available. It's called Alexa's Input, and it's on anchor.fm if you wanted to go and find it. And it's great. She's a great host. Her guests are exceedingly impressive. And I don't say that just because I was on it. I was on that podcast, but I'm the least impressive guest, she said.
Awesome. So we'll make sure to include information on both the book and the podcast in our episode notes. So definitely check those out. All right, Brent, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And I want to ask if there's anything else you want to share today.
No, I guess not. I'll just say thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you. I've really enjoyed working with the entire team at Nightfall, and I look forward to continue to doing so and seeing your technologies expand and solve all of my DLP problems. It's going to be great.
Great. Thank you once again, Brent Lassi, the CISO at Bluecore. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to CISO Insider, a podcast created and sponsored by Nightfall AI, the industry's first cloud-native data loss prevention solution. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts. The ratings and reviews help more people find us. Special thanks to Wendell Topper for podcast production support. Learn more about Wendell's work at www.createch.us. That's CREATEK.us. Follow Nightfall on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Nightfall AI. That's Nightfall AI, and email us at marketing@nightfall.ai with questions, feedback, and suggestions about CISO Insider, including suggestions for CISOs you'd like to hear from. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again next time.